I just, about 4 years ago, 5, 6 of us were sitting around having a drink, and Mass Adoption hadn't been formed yet. And we started talking about what we did in the fiat world, and I looked around and said, guys, we have a company right here, because everybody had a skill set that would help us build mass adoption. From that day on, from 5 or 6 people sitting around having a drink, we've thrown 2 Freedom Festivals. This is our 34th meetup, and we have a big event coming in the fall. So obviously, I do it because I love Bitcoin and it's my life, just like probably everyone in this room. But without your support coming to us and having interactions, not that we've done anything, but you're helping us to keep going. So I really appreciate it. In addition, we're very lucky tonight to have what I consider is 2 of the cutting edge concepts/companies out here. So I appreciate Jackson and Brian coming tonight to talk about what Onramp does, because obviously self-custody and doing that properly is probably one of the most important things you can understand in Bitcoin. And we're very, very lucky to have Tim, who's come on the Bitcoin scene. He's on fire with his Bitcoin Treasury podcast. And so there's no better person than Tim to moderate and talk with CJ. We're extremely lucky to have CJ from formerly MicroStrategy, from Strategy, to talk to us tonight about Strategy's playbook for their Bitcoin Treasury, although I think we all kind of know it. I don't think Michael Saylor hides anything from us, hopefully. And that's it. I'm going to hand it over to Tim, and Tim's going to moderate and ask some questions.
Thank you. Jackson, Brian, great to see you.
Great to see you, Tim.
Let's start from the top. Why are we having this discussion? Secret note, let's briefly touch on inflation, the structural issues of the financial system, and why Bitcoin matters in this context.
Yeah, sure thing, Tim. And Jeff and the Mass Adoption Group, thanks for hosting us. Well, there's a lot we could talk about on this subject, but we could probably be brief. From my context, everyone in this room, and more so the people who are not in this room, have a big problem on their hands. There's a lot of structural issues with the fiat monetary system. It's a debt-based system that requires ever more debt to be issued and ever more currency to be issued to pay off that debt. So the ramifications of that are our purchasing power is being debased at a greater and greater rate, and that's why we're here to talk about Bitcoin. Just real quick on my background, it'll be very quick. 2020 was the big eye-opener for me. I previously was acquiring some Bitcoin more casually. 2018, meeting Marty Bent and reading Vijay Boyapati's Bullish Kiss for Bitcoin was kind of setting me on the right track, but working in traditional finance in New York, I worked at a firm where we did fund manager research. So we looked at hedge funds and private equity and venture, and what I saw happen right in front of my eyes was a massive coordination of fiscal and monetary policy. And this was just ballooning all sorts of asset classes. It was sending equities, real estate, agricultural land, Bitcoin, everything was hitting all-time highs. And so I was speaking to portfolio managers that were incredibly intelligent people, and they were running very elaborate strategies. But what I understood was, well, it doesn't really matter what you own here, because everything is exploding to the upside because the denominator is actually going down. So that was a big unlock for me, and I started to allocate more of my personal balance sheet to Bitcoin in 2020. Ultimately, that led me to Onramp. I joined the company in the spring of 2023. I'm sure we'll talk more about that. But I think the people in this room all have a responsibility to continue to share the message of what's actually going on in the financial system, how that's impacting your loved ones, your community, and ultimately why Bitcoin is a way to protect your purchasing power and your loved ones from these structural issues that exist.
Yeah, it's very well said. I think it's safe to assume that most people in this room understand a lot of what Jackson just walked through in terms of the issues and why Bitcoin is a very elegant solution to some of those problems. I think the context that I would add I'll do a brief background on myself as well. Spent the bulk of my career in traditional finance, in private banking. Personally, myself, sort of started to learn about Bitcoin in 17, 18. Didn't fully understand it. Had a altcoin journey, as many do. Ultimately, in sort of 19 into 20, started to realize that Bitcoin was fundamentally different. Ultimately left the bank, took a job at Coinbase, interestingly, which was fascinating for a number of reasons, just seeing how that business sort of works on the inside, a lot of the misaligned incentives there. But I always knew I wanted to that was sort of a stepping stone to doing something that was Bitcoin specific. And like Jackson, heard about Onramp in sort of early 23 and knew it was something I wanted to be a part of and help build. But some more context on like the why now, I think it's easy to talk about sort of inflation and sort of the perils of the fiat monetary system. I think what we're sitting, as we're sitting here today, there's some very monumental structural shifts happening in terms of people's recognition of Bitcoin as a potential solution. We in this room have probably known Bitcoin is the solution for some time now, but what we're actually starting to see on a much broader scale is people recognize Bitcoin for its true nature, its true risk-off nature. I think, for the past several years, as TradFi and institutional allocators have come into the space, there's been sort of a misperception of what Bitcoin is, right? It's perceived as a tech stock, something that's highly risky and risk-on in nature. When you actually study Bitcoin and you understand its objective monetary properties, you start to realize it's actually probably the most risk-off thing you could possibly own. And so that is starting to manifest. That's starting to percolate, not just with individuals who take the time to understand it, but with corporates and nation states. And so I think we are really at the dawn of a new era of people actually understanding Bitcoin's true nature. And so, I even just rewinding 12 months ago, I think I would be surprised at where we are today in terms of that trajectory. I think things are accelerating. People like to, joke around and say accelerate. Like things are accelerating right now in terms of people's education, people's understanding, people's willingness to learn. I think that's been a big part of what's happened, particularly with this new administration, and just generally removing some of the toxicity that's historically been associated with Bitcoin, right? So you could even go back to the approval of the ETFs as a very strong signal to the average person that like, hey, this Bitcoin thing's okay. It's okay for you to own it. It's okay for you to save in it. And I think everything they've done since Trump's come into power, surrounding himself with people who are not only open-minded to Bitcoin, but are actually large proponents of it. All of that is sort of accelerating the educational process for everyone who's watching this happen in real time. And that goes across individuals, corporate entities, and governments around the world who are now, not being forced, but they are opening their eyes to this new reality.
All right, so Bitcoin custody. What is it? Can you guys walk us through it? Maybe people in this room understand that you can hold Bitcoin in your head. You can hold it in your heart. You can hold it at Coinbase. And traditional finance is maybe even completely different? Can you just walk us through from the traditional finance point of view and the different forms of Bitcoin custody and why, what the advantages, benefits, and not benefits of some of these are?
Yeah, there actually is one other place you could store your Bitcoin, on your tie. I would encourage anyone else who, after this discussion, take a look at the back of Tim's tie. He has a seed phrase embroidered on there. But in all seriousness, custody is an interesting topic. One thing that probably most people would appreciate is that Bitcoin is easy to buy, but it's hard to secure for the long term. And why is that? It's really because it's scarce. There's only 21 million Bitcoin, and losses are permanent. So we're not used to this. I come, like I said, from the traditional finance world. I don't really care where my ETFs or mutual funds or whatever else I owned at the time, I don't really care where that's custodied. Is it custodied with Vanguard or State Street? It doesn't matter as much because ultimately that's record keeping. And these records are kept in many different places, they're backed up. And just if a record is mismanaged, like I said, there's backups. And it doesn't result in the evaporation of the asset. If someone mismanages a title of a property, it doesn't mean the property doesn't exist anymore. But the issue with Bitcoin, or not really the issue, but the challenge with Bitcoin is that if you do mismanage the asset, you may never get it back. So that's why, for anyone in this room who hasn't really thought critically about Bitcoin or is just earlier in the journey, this is something that you'll come to understand. It is a challenge. It's a responsibility to have to manage this asset for the long term. And there's really been two prevailing forms of custody. We could talk more about it, but just overarching, there's third-party custody, which if you think of Coinbase as an example, we could pick on Coinbase tonight. They're a third-party custodian. So if you open a Coinbase account and you purchase Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency, please don't do that. But if you were to, you have a wallet. We're Bitcoin only people, but it's okay if you're not there yet. If you have a Coinbase account, you're relying ultimately on Coinbase to manage the asset on your behalf. And why this may not be the best idea is not necessarily if Coinbase is compromised. There are issues we could talk about there. But it's more so in the fact that there's typically very weak points of authentication between an end user. So if I myself had a Coinbase account and I had Bitcoin on Coinbase, there's weak points of authentication between me and my Coinbase wallet, meaning someone could SIM swap me, get access to my phone, someone could get access to my email, and they could easily drain my account for all the Bitcoin I had there. So there's weak points of authentication, which you're getting a convenient experience, but you're ultimately giving up a lot of security. And then the other thing to consider as well, whether it's Coinbase or it's another custodian or exchange, if you're relying on one institution, they could ultimately have some sort of issue or breach or compromise or loss of keys. Even qualified custodian, Prime Trust, mismanaged their client's Bitcoin and voila, it wasn't there anymore. And I joke about it, but it's actually a very serious thing. One day you think you're going to get access to your Bitcoin, it's not there anymore because they lost the private keys. So that's a big issue. And like I said, there's only 21 million Bitcoin. About 20% of that is estimated to be lost already. And that's individuals, that's businesses, that's exchanges. And so generally, it may not be the best idea. It's okay if it's a little bit maybe, but you don't want to generally have a lot of Bitcoin on an exchange. The flip side is self-custody. And so probably most people in this room are proponents or have at least tried self-custody and would advocate for it. The idea is that you ultimately manage the asset yourself, you bear the responsibility of it. I think there's a lot of great things about it, and I'll likely always have some amount of Bitcoin in self-custody, but the realization is as this thing appreciates over time, it becomes harder and harder to do only self-custody. You think about your family, you think about the ongoing key management. The best way I would think about self-custody is if you owned a firearm, you kind of have to be using your gun pretty frequently to stay polished and know how to defend yourself and how to use it if you had to use it. And the same thing is true with key management. If you're not actually using your signing devices or hardware wallets and you're not checking up on your seed phrases regularly, you may run into an issue, let alone maybe your spouse or your children have an issue down the line. And so there's certainly more we could discuss there, but these are these two prevailing forms of custody. I want to let Brian add some thoughts too. Ultimately, people have had to kind of navigate this and play hot potato with the Bitcoin. Do I leave it on River? Do I leave it on Coinbase? Do I take possession of it? What do I do? And so there's naturally this challenge, and it only becomes harder as the price appreciates. There's more risk vectors, and as the price appreciates, it's just, it's growing as a percentage of your wealth and net worth, and so there's just more things to consider.
Yeah, all of that is very well said, Jackson. I think what I would add is, for one, there's no perfect solution, I would say. Like, as Jackson sort of alluded to, Bitcoin is this alien technology, something that's very different than any other asset that's ever existed, particularly in terms of how it's custodied and stored. Taking that a step further, what's even more unique about it is something that's native to the protocol called multisig, which actually allows you to distribute ownership of the Bitcoin, or distribute control of the Bitcoin, I should say, across multiple parties. And so the two sort of solutions that Jackson has outlined, whether it's third-party custody or self-custody, you could improve either of those by using some form of multisig. So if you think about it on the Coinbase side of the world, Coinbase uses multisig. The issue with their cold storage multisig is that they hold all the keys. So they still have single entity risk. There was a perfect example of this not too long ago with the Bybit hack, where now granted it was Ethereum and there's various nuanced differences between Ethereum-based multisig and Bitcoin multisig, but let's just put that aside for now. Great, they were using multisig, but the entity itself was compromised and the multisig didn't end up helping them in that respect because the entity itself was compromised. And sort of same dynamic on the self-custody side, and you can do a little bit of better job of it, but the reality is if you set up your own multisig, you may think you're distributing risk, and it's better than having single key, I would certainly say that, but you yourself are still the single point of failure in the sense that you have the ability to affect control of the Bitcoin by yourself. Now, if you distribute those keys to family members, that's an okay idea, but then you have to trust that family member. And there's basically, this gets to the point of like, there's no perfect solution here, but you want to distribute risk. You want to try to reduce the amount of single points of failure that exist. So that's kind of where we've been for the first 15 years of Bitcoin's history. You either trust a single entity, hope that they do a good job of managing the asset, or you take it upon yourself to figure out how to self-custody, hopefully get more advanced over time, do multisig, do a geographically dispersed multisig ideally. But there hasn't really been a solution in the middle. Like those are sort of two ends of a spectrum in my mind of completely trusting someone external or completely trusting yourself. And so what we've sort of pioneered at Onramp is an extension of what you've probably heard like the Unchained and Casas of the world do, which is called collaborative custody, where they're using multisig, but in most instances, the client still holds 2 out of the 3 keys. And the third key is held by the entity. And they're really there as a backup, or if the end client needs help with anything. And that's great. It's probably better than doing it yourself. You have some person you can talk to at least if you have any issues updating your firmware or whatever. But at the end of the day, if you have 2 out of the 3, that burden is still on you of securing and protecting those 2 keys. And so what Onramp does is say, let's use multisig because that is sort of objectively superior than single sig in most situations. Let's use multisig, but instead of having the client hold the private keys, we're going to take those 3 keys and distribute them across distinct institutions. So Onramp, our company, only holds 1 key in a 2 of 3 quorum, and then we partner with other custodians to hold the other 2 keys. The end result of that is none of those entities, so none of your counterparties actually have unilateral control of the asset. And the reason that's really important is because it allows the end client to retain some amount of control while still not managing key material. Because the funds cannot move without the explicit direction of the end client to say, hey, Onramp, I want to withdraw X amount of Bitcoin to my self-custody. Sure, so we start that process. How it works in detail is Onramp then does a verification process with the end client to make sure that they are who they say they are. This is a valid transaction that they want to occur. We then provide 1 signature, and you need 2 out of the 3 to sign. So once we do that, we then pass a half-signed transaction to our other key partner. They then do a separate verification process. So it's redundant in that sense. There are multiple verifications that are happening in any movement of funds. And once they do that verification, they would provide the second signature that would then affect movement of funds. So in that whole process, none of that, first of all, would have happened without the client wanting to do something. And so there's ultimate transparency in that you have a segregated on-chain wallet that you can audit at any time on your own node at home. You can see your Bitcoins in there and you say, hey, I want to take a piece out and I want to put this in my self-custody, or I want to take some out and put some on a Lightning wallet because I'm going to go spend some Bitcoin. And you just submit a request to us and we work on your behalf with our other key holders to affect the movement of funds. And so what this ends up doing is going back to the you want to eliminate single points of failure. And in this setup, you know, in my mind, for the first time, there's actual fault tolerance in the sense that even if one of the counterparties were to have an issue, be compromised, your funds are still safe, as the two other key holders can move the assets. That's not really true of any other, certainly any other third-party custody arrangement. And even, you know, if you're doing your own multi-sig, you could still be compromised in some way where, you know, two of the keys are in the same place, or an attacker knows that one key's here and one key's there because they've done some sleuthing. I think the other reality that people don't love to talk about, but I think it is just a reality as we move forward in this digitized world, is like, you know, if your data is not already out there, like it's probably going to be hacked, released, sleuthed at some point over the next several decades. And so it's not too crazy to think that we could live in a world where it's not very difficult for an attacker to know how much Bitcoin you have and know where you live. And so that becomes, you know, if you're just thinking about long-term threat vectors, you know, do you want the ability to affect control from your house? Because, you know, you have a family, you have kids, like that becomes a real risk factor, the proverbial wrench attack. And again, none of this is to say it's all or nothing. Like Jackson said, like I'm always going to have some Bitcoin that I only control, and it's you know, my sort of go bag Bitcoin that I have zero external dependencies. But there is a place for something, for part of your stack that you actually can't affect control because you don't manage the key material. That's actually an advantage in a lot of ways. And the way in which we do it is, you know, nuanced and elegant in that you're not controlling the key material yourself, but you're also not ceding control, unilateral control, to any one entity. So no one entity can basically have your allocation go to zero. And so that's sort of a high level on what we do at Onramp. And generally, the other thing I would add is custody is the foundation of all of this. But, you know, if Bitcoin is to be global money, which we all think it is and will develop into over time, like you're going to want to be able to access various financial services. And there's a ton of friction in doing that if you're strictly using self-custody. So there's various things like inheritance, lending, that can be done in a much more seamless and efficient way if you do have experts that are helping you do it. And again, without ceding unilateral control of the asset is the key part of all of this. But I'll stop there.
Where do you see the future of custody? Like, are we there? Is it going to evolve even more? And if you can touch on a little bit of just diving into the services that you just mentioned, Brian, lending, tax optimization, some of those other services.
Yeah, for sure. So, and before I do that, I just want to give a little more context as well about this evolution that Bitcoin's gone through over the past decade in particular. And it'll tie into what you asked there, Tim, and I promise it won't be too long. But so, I just want everyone to take a step back for a second. If you think about hardware wallets, which maybe a lot of you have used in some capacity before, they were initially brought to market. The first consumer grade really was Trezor Model 1 in 2014. And so there's at least a recognition with our business, and this will tie into the evolution, other businesses will recognize this, that as the Bitcoin price has appreciated so quickly over the course of a decade, infrastructure hasn't necessarily kept up. And so what you find is a lot of people still have single SIGs, you know, one device, one seed phrase backup, but the price isn't $500 anymore. They're managing $90,000 Bitcoin, and perhaps you have multiple Bitcoin or tens of Bitcoins, or maybe you're just starting out. But the point is, things have accelerated so quickly, and we've been in this really early stage of Bitcoin where we're in a room with 30, 40 people here talking about Bitcoin on a Wednesday night. We are still early, and so the solutions that exist in the market have really been for the early adopters. So if we want Bitcoin to be adopted in a widespread manner, and we don't want all the Bitcoin to end up in BlackRock and Coinbase and ETFs, which will inevitably happen if people only have to manage this themselves, then we may not actually push forward the future that we want for Bitcoin adoption. So this is all an evolution where 2014 price is $500 single sig. Solutions like Casa and Unchained are popular now, and they really filled a gap, whereas the price reached thousands, tens of thousands of dollars. They help clients to hold their own keys, do it responsibly, not have a single point of failure. No one really cared about Unchained's business when the price was $3,000, but as soon as Bitcoin's $10,000, $20,000, they had people banging down the door to sign up because I have a mess on my hand now. And so what we've built at Onramp, we're very confident that as the price moves confidently into six figures and doesn't stay in this period of consolidation and correction, people are going to naturally seek out more redundant solutions. And to a lot of Brian's points already mentioned, there's reasons why you wouldn't necessarily want to have all of your family's Bitcoin wealth on a single sig or even in a multi-sig in your control. And so the evolution of where this goes is we'll continue to iterate on our solution, offering new key partners. We could talk about how that's currently set up, if people are interested, but continue to add new key partners to the key quorum, adding new jurisdictions as well, because sometimes people ask about, well, what about 6102? What if the government wants to confiscate Bitcoin? We could talk about that. But so we're very confident that multi-institution will be the standard for Bitcoin custody for individuals, for corporate treasuries, for ETFs. I'm convinced that this will happen with ETFs in the next 5 years or so, maybe faster depending on how much push there is from a regulator perspective. But just imagine one entity. Coinbase is so easy to pick on, but they have 2 million Bitcoin out of 21 million in custody. They have 10% of the total supply. And so that is a massive risk to the industry. You thought 2022 was bad in terms of hurting the credibility of Bitcoin, with all of your friends and family. And they're like, oh, well, I thought Bitcoin's the same thing as Sam Bankman-Fried. Well, imagine something happens to Coinbase and the catastrophic risk that presents to the credibility of this industry that we're trying to build. So I believe that this next evolution that we're going to be in will be built on multi-institution. It doesn't mean that Onramp's the only business. There are other businesses that are going to do this, but it is going to require the end client to not have to manage and have all the responsibility of the asset, but not also just park it with a single institution. So I'm particularly excited about adding new jurisdictions. Think of Switzerland, UAE, more neutral jurisdictions to potentially have key partners there. You'll also see banks step into this as well and traditional asset managers. So that's kind of the direction this is all going.
Can I ask you one question? When you talk about multi-institutional custody, is it geographically separated, like from area, like not everything in the U.S.? Do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I could speak to that. So the way the solution's set up currently is there's 3 institutions. Our company, Onramp, we're headquartered in Texas. BitGo, which is one of the largest custodians in the U.S., specifically their trust company. BitGo Trust holds a second key. So they're also in the U.S. and South Dakota as a regulated trust company. And then the third key is held by a firm called CoinCover that specifically focuses on disaster recovery, kind of the worst case scenario. And so that's the role they play in our solution. We could talk about how that works out. And they're based in the UK. So right now, the way this is set up is you have 2 keys domestic, 1 key abroad. We also partnered with a firm, Tetra Trust in Canada. But what I'm more excited about, I'm personally not worried at all about 2 keys being in the US. Maybe I would have been 4 years ago, but I think we have plenty of signs that the US is going to be, Trump wants this to be the crypto capital of the world, whatever,
The Bitcoin superpower.
Exactly. So I'm not particularly concerned about the 6102, but I am also interested in adding other neutral jurisdictions to the key quorum.
Back to the evolution question for just a minute. I think I would take it in 2 directions. I think on sort of the individual side, in terms of, spurring more incremental adoption in terms of the average person saying, okay, I'm going to store my value in Bitcoin. How do I do it? This is something that Jackson says a lot. Like, if you go up to 10 people on the street and you say, like, will you self-custody the Bitcoin? Like, 9 out of 10 of them aren't going to learn how to self-custody the Bitcoin. They're just going to buy the ETF. If they know they need exposure, if they know they at least need price exposure, they're just going to buy the ETF because it's easier. They don't want to take the time to learn how to do it. That's the reality of like the average person out there. Like, as we mentioned before, like, we are the early adopters because we cared enough about it to learn how to self-custody, learn how to do it the right way, not foot gun ourselves. it's just not the reality for most people. And so there needs to be better solutions that aren't just trusting Coinbase unilaterally, but you can still onboard people in a much more frictionless way, more seamless way, where they don't need to take 100 hours to learn how to secure private key material. And maybe they do that over the course of time. Like the other really cool, interesting thing about what we do is like, yes, the client isn't managing keys, but like they always have the optionality to withdraw to self-custody, and we'll help them do that. We'll recommend different hardware wallets to them. We'll actually help them learn about it. And so it's that optionality to take self-custody that I think is obviously critical to the success of the asset and the protocol more generally. The other side of this evolution, I think, is if you think about institutional capital, particularly folks with a fiduciary duty to underlying clients. And one way I like to articulate this is like, if an RIA or a pension or an endowment, decides that they want to invest in Bitcoin, and they are totally right to do that. They get the thesis right, they nail it, and in 10 years from now, the custodian that they chose, something happens, and the allocation goes to zero. That is completely untenable for someone with a fiduciary role to underlying clients to get the thesis right, but because you picked the wrong custodian, that allocation is now a zero. Like, you get fired for that. And so it's a completely untenable situation. So from the multi-institution standpoint, like how I think this evolves, particularly at the institutional level and even sort of like the corporate and even nation state level, is like, kind of boils down to like, why would you trust one entity when you can trust a quorum of 2 of 3, none of which have unilateral control? Like, it inherently mitigates or distributes, spreads out the trust to the point where no one entity can screw you, basically. And so I think, we talk with people all the time, people that are drafting, bills for state legislatures that want to do strategic Bitcoin reserves. Like, people that are thinking about this from first principles, thinking about it critically, know that they cannot have a single point of failure. They're not just going to buy the ETF for the state's strategic reserve. They know that that's a bad idea. Likewise, they're not going to park it at Coinbase because that's basically the same thing as the ETFs. So they are searching out other methods. And the other reality is, self-custody is not super palatable to the institutional allocators as well, because, well, then you have a team, an investment committee who's going to be in charge of the keys. What if there's turnover on the team? There's a lot of complexity. And again, the same learning curve that applies to the individual applies to, those people at an organization. And so how I see the evolution of custody is like, we're just creating better, more frictionless, seamless solutions that are also more risk mitigated than what we've had historically in terms of trust. And so that's what I'm sort of super excited to see how it plays out, in the sense that I think we're onto something in terms of, let's use multi-sig, let's leverage the native properties of the protocol to distribute that counterparty risk, and not have the sort of dire scenario that Jackson painted, where we wake up in 10 years and maybe 30 to 40% of the Bitcoin sits with Coinbase. Like that's kind of a bad outcome in my mind. And so if we can adopt standards which allow us to, again, distribute that counterparty risk where there's not a single point of failure, and one entity going down doesn't destroy a huge amount of wealth, I think that's that would be a better direction. And one thing, just sort of tangent to all of this, is like, some people, when we start talking about multi-institution, there's sort of a misconception that what we mean is just diversifying across institutions, because if you think of an example of all the public Bitcoin miners that exist, sort of the best that they've figured out to do to date is diversifying custodians. So they have a bunch of Bitcoin, they'll have 5 different custodians, and they'll spread it out, 20% at each. And so in that scenario, if one of them fails, well, you only lost 20%. You didn't lose the 100%. So that was good. You mitigated some risk. The novel part about what we're doing is we're not just diversifying custodians, we're distributing it within a 2 of 3 quorum. So if 1 out of the 3 has an issue, you don't lose 33%, you lose 0%. And so that's just a fundamentally different arrangement than what has been sort of best practices for some of the largest Bitcoin holders in the world, is just like diversifying it across various custodians. So I think this is a sort of step function improvement on what was already the best practice.
All right, you've heard it here first. If you don't want to get screwed, talk to Jackson or Brian. I know a big part of my journey, and I was sharing this with a few people earlier, is listening to podcasts, listening to people talking about this while I'm taking a walk, driving carefully, or whatever. So to that end, Jackson, Brian, and Michael from Onramp and myself, we have a weekly podcast. If you want to listen to hundreds of hours of us talking about this, it's called The Last Trade, and you can find it on your favorite platform. Just hand it over to you guys for like final thoughts. Where can people find Onramp? And yeah, kind of a catch-all for anything that we might not have touched on so far. Also questions, if you have quick questions, that'd be great.
Quick question. I know this one's going to be a tough one to answer, but what is sort of the threshold, the risk-benefit threshold to use Onramp? You know, if I have 500 sats, it probably doesn't make sense. But like just generally in terms, because I don't know what the cost is, it's a little bit more of an inconvenience than having your old cold wallet. But where is the threshold if someone comes in and says, I have this much, you probably say, you know, come back to me when you have a little bit more value.
That's a great question. So there's a couple of different ways to answer it. The way that I think about it personally, and I told Jeff about this on the ride up, was we tend to work with people who have a more material exposure to Bitcoin. That doesn't mean that you have to own 10 Bitcoin or 50 Bitcoin or 100 Bitcoin. It could mean that you own 2 Bitcoin or you own a Bitcoin, but it's a significant portion of your net worth. And so typically our client demographic on the individual side skews to be people that are like the people in this room who have more Bitcoin than they can afford to lose. And for the more technically sophisticated people, they're using what we kind of refer to as a barbell strategy, where they're managing some amount of Bitcoin in self-custody, and then they have some amount of Bitcoin in their Onramp account. That's what I do personally. I'm majority in my Onramp account. We could talk about why. I touch on it a little bit. But so the way our pricing is set up, it's $150 per month, so it's $1,800 per year. So it may not make sense at the moment for someone who has 0.25 Bitcoin. They could be a client, but they may not want to pay the fees. But if someone has 3 Bitcoin or they have 10 Bitcoin, it's 50% of their net worth, then they may consider us because they want to make sure that they have the security, the robustness of the custody solution. They also want to make sure that their spouse, children have easy access. That's a big one for me too, is the inheritance thing is a real challenge with self-custody, to put it simply, but then also access to financial services. So we don't necessarily have a minimum to work with us. We just have a minimum fee, which may be prohibitive for some people, but it's not for the ultra-wealthy people.
Yeah, maybe just one small bit to add to that is, you know, if you think about custody historically in the industry, it's sort of been subsidized to some extent, at least in sort of the third party world. And what I mean by that is, if you are holding coins on Coinbase, you think you're paying nothing for custody, but you're effectively paying for the tail risk that it could go to zero and you could lose 100% of it. Similarly, you pay $200 for a hardware wallet, but there's other embedded costs in, well, what if you screw it up? And so in our minds, like, there is a cost and a value associated with what we deem to be a superior model of custody, in the sense that you can't, like Jackson said, like you can't afford to lose it. So it's worth something to be able to have the peace of mind that you're not going to screw it up yourself, for one, or that one entity is not going to screw it up for you. And so that's kind of our methodology and our thinking on it, is like, historically, people think they're paying very little, but they're actually paying a lot for various tail risks that could go wrong. And our value that we provide is mitigating those tail risks. So there's some value associated with that. So yeah, that's kind of how I would think about it.
Hey guys, how's it going? So my question is, what would you estimate is like the minimum amount of time where you could move funds in like a dire situation? Let's say it's like 9 a.m. on a Saturday and you desperately need like a good portion of your money for something serious. Could we get that done in like 24 hours over a weekend or like?
Yeah, so I would say the standard SLA would be 24 to 48 hours, and it ultimately depends on just the client's urgency to move forward because there's two keys required with two independent institutions. So play this out real quick. You log into your Onramp account with email, password, 2FA. You hit the withdrawal button. You put in a Bitcoin address. You put in 2 Bitcoin you want to send to your cold card. It's going to prompt you to book time with a member of the Onramp operations team, and you're going to have a conversation. We'll make sure that the client's on the other end, not under duress. Different checks that we'll do to verify. That video is reviewed by our operations compliance team, provide that first signature, and then separately you're booking time with BitGo as a second signer there to provide that second signature, independently verifying. And so that could be 24 to 48 hours typically. We've done it faster than that. I would say the fastest is 12 hours if there's a lot of urgency for clients, but BitGo set up for virtually 24/7 signing. Onramp, our signing is more so like 8 to 6, but we can do it urgently as well if clients need. We have done it before.
This might be a silly question, but because there's essentially everybody's Bitcoin is held in a separate wallet, there's no staking done by you guys behind the scenes. The Bitcoin sits there and stays there, and that's that.
Yeah, appreciate that. So everything's segregated on chain. So when a client establishes an account, whether it's in their name, their trust name, their business name, they're going to have their own on-ramp vault or their own wallet, and they're going to be moving their own Bitcoin, their own UTXOs into that wallet. And so they don't even need to log into their on-ramp account. You could check on a mempool, like a public block explorer, or you could run your own node, and you could just take your public address and verify 24/7 on chain. So of course, there's an aspect of trust there, but you can always verify 24/7 that your Bitcoin is sitting in your vault, not being touched.
Hi, thanks you guys for coming today. It's been very interesting. You mentioned, three-party custodians. Is there a way I could do like an unknown party, like unknown to you guys? Because I think right now, the way it's set up, that who the other parties are. Is there a way that we could set it up so that one party is unknown to you and only known to me or my descendants?
What's the, what's your concern embedded in that?
So the concern would be that who the other two custodians are. There could be a conclusion, or that two of the three could be hacked, right? Or if you knew maybe you have a record of who they are, and you could be hacked, and they could know who else to go after, right? So the question is, could there be an unknown party that's only known to select individuals?
Yeah, I would say the answer is no at the moment in terms of having an unknown party participate in the key quorum. Could certainly speak to in more detail how the architecture is set up from a key management standpoint. One thing we didn't talk about, and I want to be brief in terms of everyone's interest in time, but we also have a $100 million policy per incident. So every client has insurance covered, specifically to cover collusion and negligence by key partners. So it's a syndicate through Lloyd's of London. And so this is pretty critical. We always anchor to the best form of insurance in Bitcoin is typically key management, because you could be an FTX creditor and wait, years to get your money back, and you missed out on the upside from the bottom of 2022. So insurance is typically best by mitigating risks and having no single point of failure. But to that end, specifically around the collusion concern, or if Onramp or BitGo acts negligently, that is covered by that policy. And again, it's per incident, and that is relevant because every client has their own wallet, so there can only be one incident, one wallet at a time.
I'll try from back here. I'm curious, if I went with an ETF instead of you, I would think my risk would be considerably lower. And if Fidelity lost all their keys, or Fidelity's ETF, whatever Bitcoin they're using to substantiate themselves, if they had a problem with that, I wouldn't think that would fall on me. That would fall on Fidelity, and they'd have to remedy it, and I'd be insulated from it. What am I missing?
Yeah, it's a fair question, and there's a lot of things that could be discussed there. So I think maybe what your bias is toward is Fidelity's a very reputable company. They've been around a long time. They have a great business, and they.
My bias is simply avoiding risk.
Sure.
And
so
there's some level of risk with you guys, like this other gentleman just pointed out, where I don't know who these other two parties are. You do.
Yeah. So well, just one quick, and then yeah, Brian. So the thing is, there's no bailouts in this system, right? So if Fidelity did mismanage keys, how are they going to make you whole? Is really the question. And so I don't know what Fidelity. I'd be way more inclined to trust Fidelity than I would trust the BlackRock IBIT, because they custody with Coinbase. But there's typically a massive mismatch between the custodies, or the assets under custody, and the insurance policy. So Coinbase is such an easy one to pick on, but they have a insurance policy that's about 300-ish million last I checked, and they custody like $600 billion of assets. So the question would be, how do you get made whole? But Brian probably has a more eloquent way to respond.
No, that's part of it for sure. Is there's no guarantee that they would even have the ability to make you whole, and that's even more important if we just roll this forward like a decade and Bitcoin's at $1 million a coin, and then they really don't have the ability to make you whole if something were to go wrong. So that's sort of the first part of it. The second part, and just sort of comparing the risk dynamics of, again, single entity exposure versus a multi-institution quorum, it's fundamentally different in the sense that in order for a single entity custodian to quote unquote collude, they don't have to convince anyone else, right? Like they could just do something nefarious or even negligent and lose the assets. Whereas in a multi-institution model, yes, theoretically, key partners could collude. For one, it would destroy the business, so there's not really an incentive to do so. Two, there's an insurance policy against specifically that. And three, one bad actor has to convince another key holder to also be a bad actor, which is a order of magnitude more difficult than one entity convincing themselves to be a bad actor. So that's really how I would describe the fundamental difference in terms of risk profile.
Any other questions? Going once, twice? Any closing thoughts? Can I do a little CTM?
Yeah. So
Whatever that means. Call to action, Tim. Come on. Call
yeah,
to
one thing to just call out real quick would be, I mentioned to Jeff, just for hosting us and to add some value to all of you, if you ever were inclined to work with us, we would offer $150 off your first year fees for anyone who's here. We're part of the Mass Adoption Organization group. And so you can get in touch with us directly, but there is a code. Jeff, I guess you could distribute that after the fact. It's just Mass 150. But really, a lot of the ways these conversations happen is it's very personal, and we know all of our clients well. It's like you're never reaching out to a chat bot. You're never trying to get a hold of someone. You have people's cell phone number. You have their emails. We respond to you. And so if anyone is interested in learning more, we'll certainly get you your questions answered. We'll onboard you. But we did want to just have that as a token of appreciation, also for your time coming out here. If you ever did want to work with us, we can discount the fee rate a bit there.